The order came at 4:47 in the morning, delivered with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Carter, kennel duty. The Malinois in Block C is yours now." Nobody explained why every certified handler had already walked away from that dog. Nobody mentioned the shaking, the silence, the way Viper pressed himself into the back corner of his cage and refused to move when footsteps got too close. Nobody told Emily Carter that 3 veterans had tried and failed and filed formal transfer requests just to get away from him. They just handed her the mop and pointed down the hall. What they didn't know, what nobody at Raven Hollow Military Hospital had bothered to find out, was that the nurse standing in front of that cage had once treated a gunshot wound in the back of a moving vehicle at 0200 hours, 60 kilometers inside hostile territory, with her bare hands and a field kit half the size of her boot. They thought they were punishing her. They had no idea what they had just set loose. If this story is already pulling you in, stay with me until the very end. Like this video, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The fluorescent lights in Block C buzzed the way lights always did in places nobody cared about, a low, irritating hum that had probably been reported for maintenance 6 times and ignored every single one. Emily pushed through the metal door at 4:52 a.m. and was immediately hit with the smell, antiseptic over something older, something animal and afraid. She had smelled fear before, in different forms, on different kinds of living things. She set her supply cart against the wall and walked slowly toward the cage at the far end. Viper was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old according to the printed card zip-tied to his kennel door. The card also listed his former unit, 3rd Special Operations Support Battalion, and a duty status box that had been stamped in red ink, inactive. Below that, someone had taped a yellow warning label. Handler caution, unpredictable, do not approach without supervision. Emily read all of it. Then she looked past the paper and looked at the dog. He was tucked into the back left corner, spine curved, tail flat. His ears were down, but his eyes were open, tracking her from the moment she came through the door. Not aggressive, not even particularly afraid, not in the immediate sense, just watchful. The way something watches when it has learned that being watched is the last warning it gets before things go wrong. She didn't approach the cage. She pulled a folding stool from beside the supply cart, set it 6 feet from the kennel door, and sat down. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not to anyone in particular, just out loud, into the room. Viper's eyes didn't move from her face. She sat there for 11 minutes without speaking or moving, and then she pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket and started writing, patient notes from the overnight shift she still needed to finish. Regular work. Mundane work. The kind of thing that required nothing from him and produced no sudden sounds. By 5:20 a.m., his ears had lifted slightly. Not up, but less down. She cataloged that. Raven Hollow Military Hospital occupied a converted army installation 40 minutes outside of Greer Falls, a mid-sized city in the Mountain West that had never quite figured out what it wanted to be. The hospital served active military, veterans, and the family members of service personnel, a broad mandate that had, over the past decade, grown to include a small but formally designated military working dog unit. The MWD ward occupied one wing of Block C, 3 kennels, a shared examination room, and a coordination office that doubled as a break room for the overnight staff. Emily had been assigned to Block C for 6 days. She had been at Raven Hollow for 3 weeks, transferred from a civilian trauma center in another state, a transfer that had come with very little explanation and even less fanfare. The official paperwork listed her as a registered nurse level 2 with a background in emergency medicine, which was accurate, which was also, in the way of most accurate things, deeply incomplete. She was 31 years old. She was from Fort Drummond originally, though she hadn't been back in years. She had a small scar along the inside of her left forearm that she'd gotten when she was 19, and she never explained it, and nobody had ever asked. At Raven Hollow, people had mostly noticed that she was quiet, and that she moved quickly, and that she didn't laugh at the same things the other nurses laughed at. Sergeant Donna Pruitt, who had been running Block C's nursing assignments for 4 years, had formed her opinion of Emily Carter within 48 hours of her arrival. "She thinks she's better than us," Pruitt had told the unit clerk, loudly enough that it was clearly meant to be overheard. She's got this way of just watching everything, like she's judging. Emily had heard it. She hadn't responded. She'd written 2 lines of notation in a patient chart and kept walking. The kennel assignment had been Pruitt's idea. That part was obvious enough. Official framing: nursing staff should familiarize themselves with all patient populations, including the MWD unit. Actual intent: get the new girl on mop duty and see how long she lasts before she complains. Emily hadn't complained. She'd gone in at 4:52 a.m. and sat on a folding stool and watched a traumatized dog watch her back. And she'd found it, strangely, to be the most honest part of her week. Colonel Marcus Hale ran Raven Hollow the way. Certain men ran certain things, with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong, and therefore couldn't entirely imagine it. He was 54, career Army, 3 combat deployments in his service record, and approximately 1 flexible thought in his entire administrative history. His office was large, his uniform was pressed, and his opinions arrived fully formed without any visible process of formation. He had 3 standing positions on the MWD program. 1, it was an asset to the hospital's mission profile. 2, results justified resources. 3, any working dog that couldn't produce results was a resource drain and should be processed accordingly. He had communicated Position 3 to the Block C unit chief twice in the past month, specifically regarding Viper. The animal has been evaluated by 4 certified handlers, he'd said, in the second of those conversations, which had taken place in his office with the door closed and 2 other department heads present. Every evaluation has resulted in the same conclusion. The dog is psychologically compromised and has not responded to rehabilitation protocols. I don't see a productive path forward for the program. The unit chief, a quiet man named Captain Aldridge, had asked if they might try 1 more round of behavioral assessment before making a final determination. Hale had looked at him for a long moment. "Captain, we have obligations to this facility that go beyond sentimental attachment to individual animals. Process the paperwork." The paperwork had not yet been fully processed, because Aldridge had stalled it twice, buying time in the only way available to him, which was bureaucratic friction. A missing signature here, a misfiled form there. It was not a permanent solution. It was 3 to 4 weeks of purchase delay. Emily didn't know about any of this yet. She knew about the yellow tag on the cage. She knew Viper pressed himself against the back wall when people walked by. She knew he hadn't eaten a full meal in 9 days, according to the feeding logs posted on the kennel door. That last one she knew because she checked the logs first thing. Insufficient caloric intake in a working dog of Viper's size pointed to either illness or stress response. She'd seen stress suppression in the field before, the way the body shuts down appetite when the nervous system is running hot for too long, burning resources just on staying ready, staying braced. The body stops wanting food because it can't spare the attention. She made a note. Then she went back to her regular rotation and didn't mention any of it. The shift change at 6 a.m. brought Pruitt in, along with a younger nurse named Gallo and the overnight tech, Bowers, who was already halfway out the door with his jacket on. Pruitt did a slow scan of the block on her way in, her expression suggesting she was looking for something to correct. She found Emily washing her hands at the utility sink. "How'd our problem dog behave?" Pruitt asked. The way she said it had a specific texture, not quite mockery, but close enough to it that it had plausible deniability. "Quiet night," Emily said. "He eat anything?" "Not yet." Pruitt made a sound that was halfway between a sigh and a laugh. "Yeah, he doesn't eat, he doesn't respond to commands. He barely moves." 3 handlers couldn't get through to him. Hale's already got the processing order half written. She picked up the morning chart board and started flipping through it. "Don't get attached, Carter. That dog's got maybe 2 weeks. Emily dried her hands. She looked at the back of Pruitt's head for a moment, the way she sometimes looked at things. Steady, measuring, quiet. "You read his full record?" Emily asked. Pruitt didn't look up. "Don't need to. 4 handlers, same result." "His full medical record," Emily said. Not the behavioral assessments, the actual field record." Now Pruitt looked up. Her expression was slightly impatient, slightly amused. "He's a dog, Carter. He's a special operations working dog with 47 documented field deployments," Emily said. "Not sharp, not heated, just informational." "That's not nothing." Pruitt stared at her for a second, then went back to the chart board. You want to spend your free time reading dog files? Knock yourself out. Some of us have patience. She walked off. Gallo, who had been hanging back near the door and clearly trying to become invisible, gave Emily a quick, sidelong look that was almost sympathetic before following. Emily picked up her bag. Her shift was over. She had 4 hours before her next one started. She went to the records office and requested Viper's complete service file. It took the records clerk 20 minutes to find it. Apparently nobody had pulled it in a while. And another 10 minutes to process the access request, during which Emily drank bad coffee from a paper cup and watched a maintenance worker fail to fix the buzzing light outside the door. The file was thicker than she expected. She took it to a table in the corner and started reading. Viper had been working since he was 2 years old. His initial placement was with the 3rd Special Operations Support Battalion, Handler Staff Sergeant Dominic Park. The early records were clean: training evaluations, deployment logs, performance metrics. He'd been rated exceptional 3 years running. Sense detection accuracy above 92%. Obstacle and search completion rated superior. Responded to 26 different tactical commands. Park's notes were terse in the way field notes were always terse, but there was something in them, a word here, a phrase there, that told you he knew the dog well. She found the incident report 14 months ago. It was a training exercise, not even a deployment, a domestic simulation exercise at a reserve installation involving live fire drills and explosive detection under stress conditions. Viper had been 18 months into his current assignment, performing well, in the middle of what should have been a routine evaluation day. Somewhere in the transcripts, 3 pages of bureaucratic language that had clearly been written by someone who didn't want to write it, was the shape of what had happened. A detonation. Simulated, controlled, but closer than intended. A concussive wave that knocked 2 training personnel off their feet. And Viper, whose handler had been standing 6 feet away when it went off, had watched Park go down. Park was fine. Mild concussion, back on duty in 2 weeks. But the report noted, briefly, almost as a footnote, that Viper had exhibited what they called aberrant response behavior in the 3 exercises following the incident. Wouldn't advance toward the blast site. Broke formation under sustained sound stress. 2 subsequent handlers had reported inability to reestablish bond. And then the report ended. No follow-up. No behavioral recommendation. No specialist consult. Just a notation that the dog had been reassigned for further evaluation and a transfer record that put him at Raven Hollow 6 months later. Nobody had told anyone what they were dealing with. They'd just moved the problem down the chain. Emily closed the file. She sat with it for a moment. Not the information, but the shape of it. The concussive event. The visual trauma of watching a trusted handler go down. The chain of subsequent handlers who never knew what they were working with, who tried standard protocols on a dog that needed something none of the standard protocols were designed for. He hadn't failed. He'd been failed, repeatedly, by people who hadn't read the file. She picked up her bag, signed the file back in, and walked out into the early morning. She came back to Block C at 11 p.m. that night, her own time, off shift, with a small container of high-protein wet food she'd bought from the commissary with her own money. She didn't ask permission. She didn't tell anyone. Viper was awake when she came in. He tracked her from the corner the same way he'd done before, but his ears moved, a small involuntary adjustment, registering her as known. She set the food container down outside the kennel door, opened it, didn't push it in, just let the smell reach him. She sat on her stool. "I read your file," she said, conversationally, the way you talk to someone you've just learned something significant about. "All of it." Viper's nose moved, just slightly. "You were there when Park went down. You watched that happen and nobody ever addressed it. They just kept putting you through the same drills and wondering why you couldn't perform." She paused. "That's a bad system." She watched him for a moment. "I've seen that before," she said. Quieter. "Not with dogs, but I've seen it." She didn't elaborate. The specifics weren't the point. The recognition was the point. Around midnight, Viper moved forward. Not much, maybe 2 feet from the back wall to the middle of the kennel floor. He lay down with his chin on his paws. He didn't eat, but he hadn't moved away from the smell of the food either. Emily noted the time, noted the behavioral shift, and wrote it down. She came back the next night, and the night after that. Well, by day 4, she'd been observed. She came in for her regular morning shift to find Pruitt waiting near the Block C entrance with her arms crossed and an expression that had decided something before Emily walked through the door. HR flagged your access log, Pruitt said. 3 off-shift entries to the kennel block in 4 days. I'm aware, Emily said. That's not in your assignment. You don't have unsupervised access clearance for the MWD unit on your own time. I checked the regulations. Nursing staff have general access to all patient areas unless specifically restricted. There's no restriction on MWD block access for my credential level. Pruitt's expression shifted slightly. Hale's not going to like this. He doesn't have to like it, Emily said. Then, because she could see where this was going and it wasn't going to help anything, I'm not trying to make a problem. I'm observing a behavioral pattern in a dog that hasn't had anyone properly document his stress response since the Leland incident 14 months ago. If the records are accurate, nobody's actually read his full field file. His handlers read his records. His behavioral assessments, yes, not his complete field record. There's a documented concussive event and a traumatic visual incident that should have triggered a specialist behavioral consult. It didn't. I think that's worth noting. Pruitt stared at her. You've been here 3 weeks. Yes. And you think you figured out something 4 certified canine handlers missed? Emily considered how to answer that. I think I read the file all the way to the end, she said. That's all. The silence between them had weight to it. Pruitt's expression cycled through something, not exactly doubt, not quite anger, but something in the space between them that Emily recognized as the beginning of someone reconsidering a fixed position and not being happy about it. I'm going to have to report this to Hale, Pruitt said. That's your call, Emily said. I'll be in Block C. Colonel Hale did not summon her immediately. He waited 2 days, which Emily took to mean either that he was gathering information or that he was deciding whether she merited the energy of a response. She kept her morning appointments with Viper, kept her regular patient rotation, kept her notes, and waited. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the unit clerk who found her changing an IV line in Ward 4 and relayed the message with the flat effect of someone who had been the bearer of administrative bad news often enough to have stopped making anything of it. Hale's office was on the 2nd floor, corner room, window facing the main approach to the facility. He was behind his desk when she came in, and he let her stand for a moment before he looked up. A small maneuver that was supposed to communicate something, and in Emily's experience usually communicated only that the person doing it had been told somewhere that it worked. He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Nurse Carter, sit." She sat. I've been made aware of some unauthorized after-hours access to the MWD unit. Technically authorized, she said. Regulation 7.4, Nursing Staff General Access Provision. Something moved in his expression. The spirit of that regulation doesn't cover. The text does, she said. Neutral. I can provide the reference. He looked at her. You're challenging my interpretation of facility policy. I'm clarifying a factual point, sir. The sir was not sarcastic. She said it straight, the way she'd been saying it for years in other contexts he didn't know about. And that straightness was its own thing, something he couldn't quite read the temperature of. He leaned back. The dog you've been spending time with is going to be processed out of the program. The decision is already made. I'd like to formally request a 30-day behavioral evaluation period, Emily said. I believe there's documented evidence of an unaddressed trauma response that hasn't been properly treated. If I'm wrong after 30 days, the processing order stands. You're a nurse, Hale said, not a canine behavioral specialist. I have field experience with stress response in working animals. Which was true. Which was not the entirety of what she had, but was what she had documentation for that wouldn't open a longer conversation. He studied her. The expression on his face was the expression of a man deciding whether something is worth the effort of pressing down or whether it's easier to let it run out. 30 days, he said finally. If there's no measurable improvement, the processing order moves forward and you go back to your regular assignment without further incident. Understood, she said. He waved her out. She was in the hallway before she let herself take a full breath. 30 days. It wasn't much, but it was something. She started working with Viper the next morning. Not with commands, not with drills. She started with presence. The same sustained, low-key presence she'd established from the beginning, but now with the kennel door open. She sat inside the space with him, did her charting, made no demands. On day 2, she brought a short training lead and laid it on the ground between them. Left it there. On day 3, he sniffed it. She didn't react, didn't praise him, didn't reach forward, just noted it. Her background in trauma response, the kind she'd accumulated in conditions most of the staff at Raven Hollow would have found difficult to imagine, had taught her that recovery from acute stress followed certain patterns. The nervous system, in animals and in humans, needed time above all else. Not stimulus, not pressure, not motivation. Time, repetition, and the consistent absence of threat. The brain needed to learn, slowly, that the worst thing had already happened and the world hadn't ended. She built a sound desensitization protocol from scratch, working with audio recordings on her phone. Quiet at first, barely audible, layered over his feeding times. She started with background noise, general movement sounds, work sounds. She worked her way up, over 2 weeks, incrementally. She tracked every meal. He was eating, not fully, but more than before. His posture in the kennel had changed. He moved differently. The ear position, the tail position, the way he tracked her when she came through the door. On day 17, she walked him outside for the first time, just around the perimeter of the Block C yard, on a long lead at his pace. He was stiff for the first 50 yards. Then something in him shifted and his stride opened up, and he walked like he was remembering what walking like that felt like. She gave him the space to remember. On day 22, she used his first command, sit. She said it once, quietly, without drama. He sat. She didn't celebrate. She just said good in the same quiet register and moved on. She found out about the evaluation by accident. She was in the records annex running a routine documentation update when she overheard 2 unit staff members in the corridor, not trying to be quiet, clearly not aware anyone was close enough to hear. Special Ops K9 evaluation's been moved up, next week. The annual one? Yeah, Commander Reed's team, direct from Braxton Command. That's early. Budget review. They're assessing all the regional MWD programs. Any dog that doesn't pass gets cut from the rolls. Emily stood very still. Block C's Malinois is going to get flagged, the first voice continued. He's still on inactive status. The evaluation team's going to pull his file, see the processing order already started, and that's going to be it. Hale's not going to fight it. He never does. Footsteps receded. The corridor went quiet. Emily counted what she had. 23 days. One dog who was no longer pressing himself into a back corner, but who had never once been put through any formal evaluation protocol. One processing order that was technically still pending, and a military evaluation team arriving in less than 7 days that she hadn't known about until 30 seconds ago. She picked up her notebook and walked back to Block C. When she pushed through the door, Viper looked up. His ears came forward. He stood. Emily looked at him. The dog that 3 handlers had called broken, that Hale had already half written off, that nobody had bothered to read all the way down to the end of his file. She crossed the room, unlatched the kennel door, and clipped on his lead. "We have 6 days," she told him. He fell in beside her like he'd been doing it for years. The door to the yard opened ahead of them, and they walked out into the cold morning air, and somewhere in the administrative wing, a processing order sat unsigned on a desk, and in 6 days a team was arriving that would decide everything. And nobody in the building had any idea that the nurse from Block C had just started her clock. 6 days was not enough time to do what needed doing, and Emily knew it. She knew it the way she'd known other things that were true and unhelpful simultaneously, with complete clarity and 0 useful options attached. 6 days to prepare a dog with a documented trauma response for a special operations evaluation that certified handlers spent months running their animals through. 6 days against a processing order that was already half written, and an evaluation team that arrived with its conclusions leaning in a specific direction before it ever set foot in the building. She ran the math, and the math was bad. She ran it again anyway, because the math being bad didn't change the situation, and the situation was what she had to work with. The first morning she used differently than she'd been using the mornings. Instead of the slow, low-pressure routine she'd been building with Viper, she took him through the yard at a faster pace, watching how he moved, how he responded to directional cues, how quickly he recovered when something startled him. A door banging somewhere behind the building, a vehicle backfiring on the access road. The startle response was still there. It was going to be there for a long time, probably forever to some degree. What she was watching for was the recovery time. How many seconds between the stimulus and the return to baseline? Day 23, 11 seconds. She noted it and moved on. She ran him through the basic obedience commands she'd been slowly introducing: sit, stay, down, come, heel. And he performed all of them without hesitation, not robotically. He had opinions. When she asked for a prolonged stay while she walked to the far end of the yard, he held it for about 45 seconds, and then broke and trotted to her, clearly deciding that whatever point was being made about staying put was less important than remaining in proximity to her. She made him go back, made him stay. Walked to the far end again. He held it for 2 minutes before she released him. "That's better," she said. He shook himself thoroughly, the way dogs do when they've tolerated something and want the world to know it. She allowed herself approximately 2 seconds of something that was almost amusement, then went back to work. The problem wasn't Viper's capability. She'd known that for a while. The problem was the sound, specifically the sustained percussive sound that the evaluation almost certainly included. The Special Operations K9 evaluation had a live fire stress testing component. She'd confirmed that by pulling the evaluation framework from the program documentation, which was technically internal but not restricted at her access level. She'd read it twice and highlighted 3 sections and sat with the implications for 20 minutes while the coffee in her cup went cold. Live fire stress testing, explosive simulation, sustained auditory stress under working conditions. She looked at her sound desensitization logs. 18 days of incremental progress. She'd gotten him through ambient noise, through construction sounds, through sustained mechanical noise. She'd introduced recorded gunfire at low volume 4 days ago. He'd shown elevated stress indicators, panting, pacing, displacement behaviors. But he hadn't shut down. He'd recovered. 12 minutes the first session, 7 the second, 4 the third. 4 minutes wasn't the same as functioning under actual live fire conditions at an evaluation site with strangers watching. But it wasn't nothing. She restructured the next 3 days around that single variable: longer sound exposure sessions closer to his actual stress threshold, meals paired with audio, training commands layered over noise, conditioning, the blunt way, not making the fear go away because the fear wasn't something you made go away, but teaching the nervous system that the fear was survivable, that the other side of it existed, that following a command through the noise was something the body could do. She pushed him harder than she wanted to. She pushed herself to push him harder than felt comfortable, because comfortable wasn't going to get him through that evaluation, and not getting through the evaluation had a very specific and irreversible outcome. By day 3 of the new protocol, his recovery time under audio stress was down to 90 seconds. She was there at 0500 and she left at 2100, and she ate whatever was quick and slept when she could, and she noticed at some point that she was doing a thing she hadn't done in a while, putting everything into something without calculating what she was going to get back from it. Just working. The way she'd worked in other places under other conditions, when the arithmetic of gain and risk stopped being relevant and the only thing that mattered was the task directly in front of her. She'd missed that, a little. She hadn't let herself notice how much. Gallo found her in the yard at dusk on day 4, sitting on the low concrete barrier at the edge of the exercise area, while Viper lay beside her with his head on her knee. Gallo had that quality some younger nurses had: genuine uncertainty about which version of things was real when 2 versions were both plausible. She stood at the yard entrance for a moment before she said anything. "Pruitt's been watching the access logs." "I know," Emily said. "Hale's already been told the evaluation team arrives Thursday." "I know that too." Gallo came a few steps closer. She looked at Viper with the expression of someone who had previously heard that something was dangerous and was currently revising that file. "He's different," she said. "He was always different than the description," Emily said. Gallo was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happened to him? Originally, I mean." Emily looked down at Viper. His breathing was easy. He was watching the far tree line the way dogs watch things they're not alarmed by, just aware of. "He watched someone he trusted get hurt," Emily said, "and then nobody ever told him that person was okay. And then they kept running him through situations that looked exactly like that moment and wondering why he couldn't hold it together." Gallo said nothing for a moment. "That's..." She stopped. "Yeah," Emily said. "What happens if he doesn't make it through the evaluation?" Emily didn't answer that. She scratched behind Viper's ear instead, and he made a low sound that wasn't quite a groan and wasn't quite contentment but was somewhere in the space between, and Gallo took that as the answer it was and left them to the fading light. Pruitt came to her directly on Wednesday morning, the day before the evaluation team arrived. She came to the kennel block, which told Emily this wasn't an ambush engineered for an audience, which she noted, and she came alone. She stood just inside the door and watched Emily running Viper through a directional command sequence for almost a full minute before she said anything. Hale's going to try to have him excluded from the evaluation roster. Emily kept her eyes on Viper. On what grounds? Active processing order. He'll argue an animal with a pending disposition shouldn't be run through an evaluation that his status doesn't support. Emily paused the training sequence, gave Viper a hand signal to hold, and turned to look at Pruitt. The processing order isn't finalized. Aldridge's 30-day behavioral evaluation is still active for 2 more days. Hale doesn't need it finalized to make the argument. No, but the evaluation team can override a local processing recommendation if they assess independent potential. That's in the program framework. Pruitt's expression did something complicated. You've really read every document associated with this. Yes. Why? Pruitt said it genuinely, not as a challenge, just as a question, the kind you ask when you're trying to understand what's actually driving something. Emily thought about how to answer it. She looked at Viper, who was still holding his position, ears forward, watching her for the release signal. Patient, present, 67 pounds of functional capacity that had been sitting in a back corner for months because nobody had read to the bottom of the file. Because he deserved someone to, she said. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Something in her posture shifted, not dramatically, not in any way that resolved the complicated history of the past 3 weeks. But something. The team lead is Commander Lucas Reed, Pruitt said. He's got a reputation for going off script during assessments. Doesn't always follow the formal evaluation sequence. She paused. That's all I know. It was more than she'd been required to share. Emily recognized that. Thank you, she said. Pruitt walked out without responding, and Emily turned back to Viper and released him from the hold with a quiet, okay, and he shook himself and padded to her side, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on his back, thinking about Thursday. Commander Lucas Reed arrived at 0730 Thursday morning with 4 members of his assessment team in a manner that suggested he had done this enough times that it had stopped being an event and become just a thing that happened. He was not what Emily had been picturing. She'd been building an image from the phrase Special Operations Evaluation Team that skewed toward formal, rigid, deeply invested in the performance of authority. Reed was 40-something, medium height, with the build of someone who'd spent years in the field and the specific kind of quiet that came from not needing people to know he was the most capable person in the room. His uniform was correct, and his posture was straight, and he carried a tablet and spoke to people briefly and listened to their answers for longer than most people expected. He toured the MWD unit at 0800. Emily was not present for that portion. She was on her regular floor rotation, covering Ward 4, trying not to watch the clock. She had put in a formal request on paper the night before, asking that Viper be included in the evaluation roster. She had attached her behavioral assessment logs, her sound desensitization records, and a 2-page summary of the original incident report and its failure to trigger appropriate follow-up. She'd had 3 hours of sleep, and her handwriting at the end was more tired than the beginning, but the content was accurate and she'd checked it twice. She didn't know if it had reached anyone. She was changing a dressing on a post-surgical patient in Ward 4 at 0922 when the unit clerk appeared in the doorway and said, "Nurse Carter, Commander Reed is asking for you in the MWD unit." Her patient, a 60-year-old retired corporal named Tibbs, who was 2 days out from a knee replacement, looked at her with the particular attention of someone who had spent decades reading room energy. "Go," he said. "I need to finish this dressing. I'm old, not helpless. Go." She finished the dressing. She washed her hands. She walked to the MWD unit at a pace that was not running. Reed was standing in front of Viper's kennel when she got there. 2 of his team members were present, both with tablets, taking notes. Viper was standing at the front of the kennel, alert, ears forward, watching Reed with the focused attention of a dog who had figured out that this person was worth watching. Reed looked up when she came in. "Nurse Carter," he said. "Commander." He looked back at Viper. I read the material you submitted. Yes, sir. Walk me through the behavioral timeline, not the documentation. Tell me what you actually observed. She told him. She started from the first morning, the corner position, the feeding logs, the ear posture. She talked about the incident report and what it implied about the unaddressed trauma response. She described the progression, the things that had worked and the things that hadn't, the sound desensitization protocol, and the specific data points she'd been tracking. She didn't editorialize and she didn't perform. She gave him the information and let him assess it. He asked 4 questions, all specific. She answered all 4 specifically. His team members typed things. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to Viper. The processing order on this animal is from Colonel Hale? Yes, sir. Hale tell you this dog was going to be excluded from today's evaluation? She hesitated. Pruitt had told her, not Hale. But the question was whether she'd been informed of that intent, not who specifically had done the informing. I was made aware of that possibility, yes, sir. Reed looked at her. His expression was the expression of someone filing something. He's on the roster, Reed said. You'll handle him. One of his team members looked up from the tablet. Commander, the regulation requires a certified K9 handler. She's handled him for 23 days, Reed said. He responds to her. Running him with anyone else today would compromise the assessment. He looked at the team member until the team member looked back at the tablet. Then he looked at Emily. Be at the evaluation site at 1300, both of you. He left. His team followed. Emily stood in the kennel block for a moment in the particular silence that follows. Something you'd spent days building toward and weren't entirely sure you were ready for. Viper's nose touched the kennel door. She unlatched it. Okay, she said. So it's today. Well, Hale found out at 100. She knew because she was walking Viper through the corridor toward the preparation area when she heard his voice coming from the direction of his office. Not his words, just the register, the particular pitch of a man who has been informed of something he did not expect and is responding to that information through the mechanism of volume. She kept walking. The preparation area was a room adjacent to the main evaluation field, a converted equipment bay with benches along the walls and a rubber mat floor. She took Viper through his warm-up routine, the commands, the movement pattern, the sustained stay with distractions. He was sharp. Whatever quality a dog had that was analogous to focus, he had it. She was running him through a directional sequence when the door opened and Hale came in. He was in full uniform, and his posture communicated a very specific kind of authority, the kind that expected its own entry to change the temperature of a room. He stopped when he saw her, and his expression ran through 2 or 3 things before it settled. This is inappropriate, he said. This animal has an active disposition review. You don't have handler certification. Reed has exceeded his remit by including this dog on the roster without my approval. Emily kept Viper in a heel at her left side. Commander Reed has independent assessment authority under the program evaluation framework, sir. Local processing orders don't override an authorized evaluation team's roster decisions. You have an answer for everything, Hale said. It wasn't a compliment. I read the documents, sir. He looked at Viper. The dog met his gaze without flinching, without aggression. Just a flat, even attention that was somehow more unsettling than aggression would have been. When this dog fails today, Hale said, the processing order goes through without further delay, and you go back to Ward 4 and you stay there. He said it with the calm of someone who has decided the outcome of a thing that hasn't happened yet, and is simply informing you of the schedule. Emily looked at him for a moment. The thing she wanted to say lived very specifically in her throat, and she had enough discipline not to let it out, because discipline was the difference between being right and still standing at the end of it. Understood, sir, she said. He left. She took one slow breath. Viper pressed briefly against her leg. Not anxious, just present. She looked down at him. Don't do that, she said quietly. I'm not spiraling. He looked up at her with an expression that dogs sometimes had, the one that meant they weren't convinced. She ran him through the directional sequence one more time. He was perfect. She ran it again, faster, through a distraction midway through. A dropped equipment bag, loud against the rubber floor. He faltered for 2 seconds, regained, completed the sequence. 2 seconds. She could work with 2 seconds. At 22:45, she walked him out to the evaluation field. The field was a wide rectangle of packed earth and short grass behind the main facility, bordered on 3 sides by a chain-link fence, and on the 4th by the tree line she'd watched Viper watch from the yard for 3 weeks. There were obstacles, barriers, search boxes, marked zones, and at the far end, the live fire range, which was separated from the main field by a concrete berm. Reed's team was already present, along with 4 other handler dog teams who were cycling through the evaluation in sequence. There was also a small cluster of observers, staff members, 2 other department heads, Pruitt, standing at the edge of the field, and beside them, arms crossed, Hale. Emily brought Viper to the staging area. One of Reed's team members came over with a clipboard and went through the identification check, confirming the dog's ID tag, confirming Emily's name and role, confirming the evaluation waiver she'd signed that morning that said she understood handler certification requirements and was participating under a commander's exception. She signed where they pointed. She looked at the field. She looked at the far end, where the berm blocked the live fire area from direct view, but not from sound. Her heart was doing something. She knew what it was and she acknowledged it, and she set it to the side, the way she'd learned to set things to the side in conditions that required her attention to be on the task and not on her own internal weather. Viper stood beside her. He was looking at the field. His ears were forward. His tail was carried level. 3 handlers ahead of them completed their sequences. One had a dog with an excellent scent detection run and a shaky obstacle course. One was clean through the whole sequence but showed stress indicators under the sustained auditory portion. One was exceptional, clean and fast and composed, which gave the observers something to compare against. Then they were next. Reed's voice carried across the field. "Carter, Viper, you're up." She looked down at him one time. He looked up at her. Then she walked him out to the start line. The first section was scent detection, a grid search for marked objects in a 30-meter zone. She gave him the search command, the first one she'd ever given him out loud in real conditions with people watching, and he drove into the grid like he'd been doing it his whole career, because he had been doing it his whole career, and every muscle in his body remembered what that felt like. He found 3 of the 4 marked objects in the first 4 minutes. He circled the 4th location twice, body tense with something she read immediately. Not failure, not avoidance, just a competing scent, something in the surface material that was overlapping. She gave him a quiet redirect, 1 word, and he drove back and marked the 4th object with his nose and held the indication. Someone in the observer group said something. She couldn't hear what. Reed's team marked the scores. She walked Viper through the rest interval and noticed his breathing. Elevated from the work, fast recovering, ears loose. He shook himself once and looked back at the field. The obstacle sequence was next. Barriers, tunnels, elevated platforms, directional changes under voice command only. He was good at this one. She'd seen it from early, the way his body intelligence worked, the pleasure he had in using it. He wasn't fast in the way the 3rd team had been fast, but he was accurate and he was confident and he never checked back at her for reassurance. He made his own decisions within the parameters of the commands, and they were all the right ones. The observer group was quiet in a way that was different from before. She noticed it without looking at them. They came through the obstacle course and stopped at the rest marker. Reed's team was conferring about something. One of them crossed the field toward her. "Next segment is the auditory stress component," the team member said. "Sustained sound exposure with task completion. You can withdraw at this stage without it affecting the preliminary scores." Emily looked at him. "We're not withdrawing. You understand what this component involves?" "Yes." He looked at Viper. He looked back at her. Something in his expression wasn't quite doubt and wasn't quite admiration, but was traveling between them. "Okay," he said. "Stand by." She turned back to Viper. She knelt, which she didn't do casually. She did it because she needed to be at his level for this, needed the contact between them to be direct and not top-down. He turned to look at her. His brown eyes were steady. She put one hand on the side of his neck. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just let him feel that she was there, that her heartbeat was even, or as close to even as she could make it, which wasn't entirely even, because she wasn't made of stone and this wasn't a training session, and the people watching included a man who was hoping they failed. Then she said quietly, "Stay with me." He blinked once, slowly. Across the field, the confirmation signal went up. The first shot cracked across the air. Viper's body went rigid. Every muscle, all of it, everything she'd been working on for 23 days, pulled taut in one single instant, and she felt it through her hand, and she kept her hand exactly where it was, and she didn't move, and she didn't flinch. 12 seconds of silence, a second shot, closer. His breathing was ragged, his ears were back. She could feel the vibration through him. Not quite shaking, but close, the deep muscle tension of a body running a fight response it had been trapped in for over a year. "Stay with me," she said. Same register, same voice. She waited. And then the third shot rang out, and she felt the moment in her hand, the specific moment when his body made a decision. And she said, "Seek," in the same quiet voice she'd been using for 23 days. And Viper drove forward into the live fire lane, and the field went completely silent except for the gunfire, and everything, every conversation, every processing order, every morning on the folding stool, and every night reading a file nobody else had bothered to finish, came down to the next 90 seconds on that field. And nobody watching had any idea that the woman at the start line had once treated a catastrophic injury under live fire with her hands, and a half-empty kit, and had never once talked about it, and had never once needed anyone to know, and was standing right now at the edge of something that had required every single thing she'd ever learned to build. The shots kept coming. Viper was still moving. He was still moving. That was the only thing Emily tracked in those first seconds. The fact of forward motion, Viper's body driving into the live fire lane with his nose down and his ears pressed back against the sound, but his legs still working, still carrying him forward into the thing that had broken him 14 months ago and every day since. The shots came in controlled intervals, suppressed rifles firing from a position behind the berm. She'd been told the sequence in the pre-evaluation briefing: 4 shots at 30-second intervals, then a rapid sequence of 6, then silence, then 2 final confirmation rounds. Designed to create unpredictability, to test whether a working dog could maintain task focus when the auditory environment turned hostile. She watched him hit the first marker and indicate correctly. Nose down, body drop, the specific posture that meant he'd found the target scent. The shot that followed came 8 seconds later, sharp and close, and she saw his shoulders hitch, a full-body flinch, the involuntary muscular response of a nervous system that had learned to associate that sound with catastrophe. He didn't stop. His nose went back down. He pushed forward to the second marker zone. She didn't realize she'd stopped breathing until her vision went slightly strange at the edges, and she forced herself to inhale. Around her, the field was utterly silent. The observer group at the boundary had gone still, in the way crowds go still when they understand that something real is happening in front of them. Not a performance, not a demonstration, but an actual thing with an actual outcome that isn't decided yet. Reed was standing 15 feet to her left. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Viper. Second marker, correct indication. The rapid sequence started. 6 shots, fast, overlapping. The kind of thing designed to saturate the auditory field and overwhelm a stress response that was already running hot. Viper broke stride. He stopped moving for 4 full seconds. His body went low. Not aggressive crouch, not defense position, something older than training. The pure animal freeze that happens when the nervous system gets more input than it can process. 4 seconds of absolute stillness while the shots cracked around him. Emily counted. She counted because counting gave her nervous system something to do besides flood, because her hand was at her side and she could not go into that field, and she could not call out, and she could not do anything except stand at the start line and wait and count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then Viper's head came up. Not because the shots stopped, they were still going, but something in him made a calculation that she had spent 23 days trying to help him make, and he made it there. In the middle of the field, under the worst possible conditions, with no hand on his back and no voice in his ear. He drove to the third marker. Someone behind her made a sound, low, involuntary. She still didn't look. Third marker. Indication correct. The rapid sequence ended. The silence that followed had a specific texture, the particular quiet after sustained noise that felt almost louder than the noise itself, the ringing absence where the sound had been. Viper moved through the silence toward the 4th marker zone. His stride had changed. She'd been watching him move for 3 weeks, and she knew his gait at every stress level, and this was something different, faster, lower, more driven, the way a dog moves when something in him has been unlocked. The 2 confirmation rounds fired. He didn't flinch. He found the 4th marker, drove his nose into the target scent, and held his indication with his whole body braced against the ground, solid and absolute. The field stayed silent. Emily exhaled. Reed's voice came across the field, quiet and level. Clear. The team member closest to the lane walked in, confirmed the indications, marked the tablet. He walked back without expression. Reed looked at the tablet. He made no visible reaction, which in Emily's experience meant either the results were unremarkable or they were significant enough that he was processing them privately. He crossed the field toward her. Preliminary scores, he said. Scent detection, 91% accuracy. Obstacle sequence, full completion, second fastest in the group. Auditory stress component. He paused. Something moved briefly across his face. 94% task completion under sustained fire. 4-second interruption in the rapid sequence, self-recovered, continued without handler intervention. He let that sit for a moment. That puts him above median for the full group, Reed said. Above median for the division in the scent and stress components specifically. Emily looked at him. She kept her face even. What does that mean for his status? It means his current processing order doesn't have the evidentiary foundation it had this morning. He glanced past her toward the observer group. She knew, without turning, who he was looking at. There'll be a formal review. He walked away. She turned to get Viper from the lane and found him already at the start line, back where she'd been standing, waiting for her. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She hadn't seen him come back. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them made a production of it, which felt right. She clipped his lead and walked him off the field. The debrief happened at 1600 in the main conference room, which was a room Emily had never been in before. Reed's team occupied one side of the table. Hale occupied the other side with 2 department heads. Aldridge was present in the corner, very carefully not making eye contact with Hale, which told her Aldridge had probably known something was coming before any of them did. Pruitt was not in the room. Gallo was not in the room. This was the room for decisions, not observers. Emily sat at the end of the table with a copy of her behavioral documentation in front of her and Viper on a stay beside her chair. The team member who'd managed the evaluation scoring had a printed results sheet. Reed sat at the center of the long edge of the table, equidistant from both sides, which was either accidental or deliberately communicative. She decided it was deliberate. Hale spoke first, which was characteristic. I want to note for the record that the evaluation today was conducted under a commander's exception that bypassed standard handler certification protocol. The exception is within my authority under the program framework, Reed said. Flat, final, moving on. The evaluation results are valid. Hale's jaw moved. The animal's performance doesn't change the fact that he has a documented behavioral Colonel. Reed looked at him. Not threatening, not aggressive, just direct in a way that had weight. I've read the documentation Nurse Carter submitted, and I've read the original incident report from 14 months ago. Would you like to tell me why a working dog with a documented traumatic event in his service record received no behavioral specialist referral before being transferred to this facility? The room was quiet in a way that had direction. Hale said, protocols at the originating unit were your responsibility to verify upon intake, Reed said. The MWD program documentation is explicit. Any incoming animal with a service-related behavioral flag requires intake assessment by a qualified specialist within 30 days of arrival. Viper has been at this facility for 5 months. There's no specialist assessment in his records. Aldridge, in the corner, made a very small movement that was almost certainly involuntary relief. I want to table the personnel discussion for the formal review, Hale said. His voice had changed register. Still controlled, but a different kind of control. The control of someone who has identified the direction of a threat and is recalibrating. The question before us is the animal's status. The animal's status is what I'm here to determine, Reed said. The personnel question is what the formal review will address. Those are 2 separate matters, and I'm handling one of them right now. He looked at his team member, who slid the results sheet toward the center of the table. Based on today's evaluation, I'm recommending removal of the inactive classification and reinstatement of Viper's working dog status, contingent on a 60-day supervised return-to-duty program. Hale said, and handler assignment? Reed looked at Emily. Nurse Carter's formal handler certification application will be expedited through the program office. Pending that, she'll operate under a provisional assignment. Emily said nothing. She noted it, the way she noted things, carefully, without reaction, filed for later when she could actually process it. She doesn't have the qualifications, Hale said. She has more field experience with this specific animal than anyone at this facility, Reed said. And based on today's results, she's clearly done something right. If you have documented objections to her provisional assignment, submit them in writing to the program office within 5 days. He closed his folder. We're done with the status question. Hale looked at her across the table. It was a specific look, the look of someone who has lost a position and is computing where to apply the next pressure. She held it for a moment and then looked away, not because she was deferring, but because she didn't have anything to prove in his direction, and they both knew it, and only one of them was comfortable with that. The formal review announcement came through 2 days later. It was a 3-person panel, 2 program oversight officers from the regional command and 1 independent assessor, convened to review the handling of Viper's intake, the absence of required specialist assessment, and the origins of the processing order. The scope was stated in the administrative memo in the neutral bureaucratic language of things that were actually not neutral at all. Pruitt showed her the memo at shift change. She held it out without preamble, waited while Emily read it, and then said, Aldridge filed a supplemental report last week, before the evaluation. He submitted the stall history on the processing order and a timeline of the intake failures. Emily handed the memo back. He's been sitting on that for a while. He filed it when he knew Reed was coming. Pruitt paused. Smart timing. Risky timing. Maybe. She folded the memo. Hale's not going to take this quietly. No, Emily agreed. He's going to come at something, probably the handler's certification angle. If he can make the provisional assignment look improper, he undermines the evaluation results, maybe the whole review. Emily thought about that. She'd been thinking about it since the debrief. The provisional assignment was the cleanest pressure point. It was genuinely unorthodox. Reed's exception was real but unusual, and anyone who wanted to push on it had a legitimate procedural hook to push on. I need to get certified, she said. The expedited application process takes 60 days minimum. Not if I can demonstrate prior qualifying experience through an alternate pathway. She'd read that section too, the night after the debrief, at 0100 with coffee that had gone cold. If I can document equivalent field experience, the certification board can waive the standard training requirement and move to a direct assessment. Pruitt looked at her. What field experience? This was the thing Lee had been sitting with for 2 days. The thing that had a very specific shape in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of a door she had chosen to keep closed and what would be required to open it. I have documentation, she said carefully, from prior service. It's classified at a level that requires a formal release request to access. Pruitt stared at her. You're telling me you have classified military experience? I'm telling you I have documentation. I'd need to file a release request with the appropriate office. Carter. Pruitt's voice had gone to a different register, not loud, careful. What exactly did you do before you were a nurse at a civilian trauma center? Emily looked at her for a moment, then she said, I was a nurse at a civilian trauma center. Pruitt waited. Before that, Emily said, I was other things, in other places. The silence between them was a different kind than their silences before. Pruitt had spent 3 weeks deciding who Emily Carter was, building a picture from the available details, and she was now getting the first clear signal that the picture had a significant section she hadn't been looking at. File the release request, Pruitt said finally. It wasn't advice. It was something more complicated than advice. It'll open other things, Emily said, once those records are in the review. I know. Pruitt folded the memo again, a gesture that was almost fidgeting, which was the first fidgeting Emily had ever seen from her. File it anyway. She filed the release request on a Thursday. The form required her service identification number, which she had memorized, and the specific classification level of the materials she was requesting access to, and a justification for the request. She wrote the justification in 3 sentences, which was fewer than the form suggested but contained everything relevant. Then she submitted it and went back to work because there was nothing else to do while the bureaucratic machinery processed a thing, and standing there watching it didn't make it go faster. That afternoon, she ran Viper through his first formal supervised training session under the provisional assignment, which meant Reed's team member, a warrant officer named Briggs, was present with a clipboard observing. Briggs had the manner of someone who had decided to have no opinion about things until he had more data, which Emily respected. The session was structured: obstacle work, scent drill, directional commands, controlled sound exposure. Viper was good. Briggs made notes. At the end he said, "Okay," which was the entirety of his feedback, and Emily took it as positive because he hadn't said anything else. She was in the middle of the post-session cool-down walk, just the perimeter of the yard, easy pace, let the dog's nervous system settle back from work mode. When Gallo appeared at the yard entrance, her face had a quality Emily had learned to read. "What happened?" Emily said. "There's a patient in the ER. Trauma intake 20 minutes ago." Gallo paused. He came in with the evaluation team, one of Reed's men. Emily walked faster toward her. "What's the presentation?" "Penetrating chest injury, right side. Collapsed lung, they think. I was in the parking structure, sir. They're saying he fell from a maintenance level, but the injury pattern..." Gallo stopped. "What about the injury pattern?" "It doesn't match a fall," Gallo said. Emily handed Viper's lead to Gallo without a word and moved. The ER at Raven Hollow was not large. 6 trauma bays built for the volume of a military medical facility in a mid-sized installation, not a level eye center. Bay 3 was occupied and busy when she came through the door, and she read the room in the first 2 seconds. Patient supine, mid-30s, unconscious. 2 IVs running, O2 sat dropping based on the monitor tone. The attending physician, Dr. Vasquez, who was good, already calling for a chest tube tray. She was not supposed to be in this bay. She was Block C nursing staff. She came in anyway. Vasquez looked up. "Carter, this isn't your rotation?" "I know. What isn't your rotation?" "I know. What's his SAT?" 84 and dropping. I've got a tension pneumo developing. I need 14 gauge, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Emily said. You need to decompress before you position for the tube or you're going to push the mediastinum further. She was already pulling gloves from the dispenser on the wall. What's his pressure? 70/40. She crossed to the bed. The injury was on the right. A penetrating wound, the edges of it wrong for a fall impact, more consistent with a directed force, something narrow. Not a railing edge, not pavement impact geometry. Vasquez made a decision in approximately 2 seconds and handed her the needle. She found the landmarks by feel, clavicle, second rib, over the top edge to avoid the nerve bundle, and decompressed. The rush of air confirmed it. SAT climbed within 90 seconds, the monitor tone shifting. Chest tube now, she said, stepping back. He's stable enough to position. Vasquez moved in. She stayed in the room because nobody had told her to leave, and she knew what she was looking at, and that knowledge was currently useful. While they worked, she looked at the wound again. Entry point, the trajectory, the location on his body. He'd been standing somewhere elevated, and something had gone through him from the right side, laterally, at an angle that wasn't consistent with impact from a fall. She was not a forensic examiner. She was a trauma nurse who had seen a significant number of injuries that someone had tried to describe in ways that didn't fit them. This one had been described as a fall. This one looked like something else. She stepped out of the bay when Vasquez had the chest tube in and the patient's pressure was climbing. She pulled her gloves off in the corridor and stood for a moment thinking. Reed's team member, injured in the parking structure. Same day the formal review was announced. She pulled out her phone and called Reed's contact number. He'd given it to her at the end of the evaluation day, which at the time had seemed like standard procedure. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. This time he picked up on the second ring. His voice was different from the debrief voice. Lower, faster. Carter? Your team member in Bay 3? I know. I'm on my way in. The injury pattern doesn't match a fall, she said. A pause. 3 seconds. Say that again. The wound trajectory is inconsistent with a fall injury, entry angle, edge characteristics. I've seen a lot of trauma. This isn't a fall. Another pause, longer. Stay in the building, Reed said. Don't talk to anyone about this. I'll be there in 8 minutes. The call ended. Emily stood in the ER corridor with the phone in her hand. The monitor sounds from Bay 3 were steadying. Vasquez's voice was calm behind the curtain. The calm of a controlled situation, post-crisis. The patient was going to live. She looked down the corridor toward the main facility entrance. then toward the administrative wing. One of Reed's men had been hurt. The formal review had been announced 48 hours ago. She stood very still and ran the sequence through again, all of it, from the processing order to the stalled paperwork to Aldridge's quietly filed supplemental report to the debrief table and Hale's face across it. And the picture that assembled itself was not complicated once she looked at it directly. Her phone buzzed. A text, unknown number. It said, "You should have let the dog go." She stared at the screen for a moment. Then she looked up, at the empty corridor, at the fluorescent lights that hummed. The same way lights always hummed in places where bad things had found enough quiet to happen in. 8 minutes ago, she had been cooling down a dog from a training session. Something had shifted, and she wasn't entirely sure when it had started or how deep it went, but she was certain now, by standing in this corridor with an unknown numbers threat on her phone and a man in Bay 3 with an injury that didn't match its story, that she was not standing on the edge of this thing. She was standing in the middle of it. She did not go looking for Reed. She went back to Block C, put Viper in his kennel, and sat down on the folding stool with her phone in her hand and the text message still on the screen. "You should have let the dog go." She read it 4 more times, not because the meaning changed, but because she was cataloging, the timing, the unknown number, the passive phrasing that was specific in its vagueness, a threat that didn't name itself, the kind that came from someone who had resources and was still trying not to use them visibly. She screenshotted it, sent the screenshot to her own email. Then she sat and thought about what she actually knew versus what she was inferring, because those were 2 different categories and conflating them was the fastest way to make mistakes. What she knew, Warrant Officer Briggs, Reed's team member, had sustained a penetrating right-sided chest injury in the parking structure. The injury pattern was inconsistent with a fall. He was currently in Bay 3 with a chest tube and climbing vitals. The formal review panel had been announced 48 hours prior. She had received a text from an unknown number within minutes of calling Reed about the injury. What she was inferring, that these things were connected. That the connection ran in a direction that pointed at someone with motive and access. That the text was meant to tell her something without saying it directly. She sat with the gap between those 2 categories for a while. Viper watched her from the kennel. He'd settled, but his eyes were tracking her the way they tracked things he'd decided were important. "I don't know yet," she said. He put his chin on his paws. Reed came through the Block C door at 1841, which meant he'd gone to the ER first and then come to her, which told her something about his priorities and his current read of the situation. He was not visibly upset. That itself was information. He had the field-trained quality of someone whose external presentation was a deliberate choice and not a default state. He looked at Viper. He looked at her. "Show me the text," he said. She showed him. He looked at it for a long time. "Unknown number," he said. "Yes. Routed through a relay, probably. Won't trace easily." He handed the phone back. His voice was level, but she caught something underneath it. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor to it, the cold functional version that preceded decisions. "Briggs is stable. The injury is what you said it was. Which means I'm treating it accordingly." He looked at her directly. "What I need to know from you is whether there's anything else. Anything you've seen or heard in this facility in the past 3 weeks that didn't sit right." She thought about it honestly. Aldridge's stall on the processing order. He was buying time, which means he was afraid of what would happen if it went through quickly. Afraid of Hale. Afraid of something. Aldridge isn't a confrontational person. He doesn't create friction unless the alternative is worse. Reed nodded slowly. "What else?" Pruitt came to me with information before the evaluation. The team lead identity, the off-script assessment style. She didn't have to do that. It was low risk, but it was still a choice. "You think she knew something was wrong?" "I think she'd been watching Hale run this unit for 4 years and had opinions she'd decided were safer to not have." Emily paused. "Until they weren't." Reed was quiet for a moment. Then, "The review panel has expanded scope. As of an hour ago, it's not just the intake failure. Criminal division is involved because of Briggs." The room felt different after he said that. Not bigger, smaller, the way spaces got smaller when the stakes clarified into something concrete. "Hale," she said. "I'm not confirming that. Not yet." But the review expanded in the 48 hours after the announcement, and Briggs was hurt today. I'm not confirming anything, Reed said again. It was not a denial. It was the careful language of someone managing an active situation who couldn't afford to say the true thing out loud until he had enough of it documented. What I need you to do is continue your normal assignment. Don't change your patterns. Don't discuss this with anyone except me. Pruitt, no one, he said. Not harshly, but completely. She looked at him. She understood what he was asking, and she understood why. And she also understood that he was operating on a timeline she didn't have full visibility into, which was uncomfortable in the specific way that incomplete information was always uncomfortable. Okay, she said. He left. She sat in the kennel block until the lights outside shifted from gray to dark, and then she did her evening checks and went home. The next 3 days were the strangest kind of operational period, the kind where you know something is moving and you can't see it directly, and all you can do is perform normality while the machinery runs somewhere out of your sightline. She ran Viper through his supervised sessions. Briggs was the supervising officer, and Briggs was in Bay 3, so the sessions were rescheduled pending his recovery, which gave her a specific kind of freedom, time with the dog that was logged and formal but unobserved. She used it well. She did her regular floor rotation. She ate in the cafeteria. She kept her expression neutral and her pace unhurried, and she did not, in any visible way, behave like someone sitting on a screenshot of a threat message and a conversation with an expanding criminal investigation. Hale was present in the facility during all 3 days. That was the strangest part, that he was there, moving through the building, running meetings, signing off on documents, performing the role of the man in charge with the same pressed uniform and fully formed opinions. She passed him in the corridor on the second day. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything. She thought about Briggs in Bay 3, who had graduated from the chest tube to a drainage system and was eating solid food, according to Gallo, who had somehow found this out and relayed it in the break room with studied casualness. She thought about the text message. She thought about Viper's service record and the 14 months of compounding failure that had started with one unaddressed incident report. And she thought about how that kind of thing didn't usually happen because of one person's malice. It happened because of systems that made it easy to look past the inconvenient thing, to move the problem down the chain, to sign off on a transfer and close the file, and let someone else deal with it later. Except sometimes there was a person behind the system, and sometimes the system was being used. On the third day, Aldridge came to find her in Block C. He was a quiet man, as she'd assessed from the beginning, compact, contained, the kind of person who communicated more through what he didn't say than what he did. He stood inside the door for a moment before he spoke. The panel asked me to provide supplemental testimony today, he said. Okay, she said. They asked specifically about the intake protocol failure, about who reviewed Viper's transfer documents when he arrived. She waited. The intake review form has Hale's signature on it, Aldridge said. He signed the standard intake confirmation, which means he represented to the program office that the required documentation review had been completed. She looked at him. But the specialist assessment was never done. No. Aldridge was very still, which means either he reviewed the documents and missed the behavioral flag, or he reviewed them and chose not to act on it. Or he didn't actually review them and signed the form anyway. Yes, Aldridge said. That too. He left without saying anything else. She stood with the implications for a moment, and then went back to Viper's afternoon session, because there was nothing else she could usefully do with an implication except wait for it to become documented fact. The documented fact arrived on a Thursday. She was in the middle of a training run, Viper in a sustained downstay while she moved obstacles, testing whether he'd hold position through environmental change, when her phone buzzed with a message from Reed's number. Panel has requested your presence tomorrow morning, 0800 Conference Room 2. Bring your release documentation. The release request she'd filed 11 days ago had come back 4 days earlier with the materials cleared for review by the certification board. She'd read through them when they arrived, her own service record, which she knew the shape of but hadn't looked at directly in years, and she'd put them in a folder and put the folder in her bag, and hadn't thought about what it was going to feel like to walk them into a room. She thought about it now, briefly, and then stopped thinking about it because it didn't change the appointment. She put her phone back in her pocket. She looked at Viper, who had maintained his downstay through the entire exchange, 63 seconds without breaking, watching her with the patient intensity of a dog who had decided that staying was worth doing because she'd asked him to. "Release," she said. He came to her immediately. "Good," she said, and meant it in several directions at once. Conference room 2 was smaller than the main conference room, which made it feel more like the real version of the thing, the actual conversation rather than the performed one. The review panel was 3 people, 2 officers from the Regional Oversight Office, whose names were on the memo as Colonel Dana Witt and Major Terrence Oakes, and the independent assessor, a civilian woman named Dr. Renata Solis, who had the focused, slightly skeptical quality of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and was not easily managed. Reed was present but seated off to the side, not at the panel table. Observer status, she understood. His involvement in the evaluation made him a subject of the review as well, which put him in a specific kind of position, invested in the outcome, constrained in his role within it. Emily sat across from the panel. She had the folder in front of her. Witt spoke first. "Nurse Carter, thank you for coming. We've reviewed your behavioral documentation on the animal in question, and we've reviewed the evaluation results from last week. We have some additional questions about the timeline of events and your own background as it relates to the provisional handler assignment." "Yes, ma'am." "You filed a release request for classified service records approximately 2 weeks ago. Those records have been made available to this panel. We've reviewed them." Witt looked at her. Something in the look had a quality that Emily had difficulty reading for a moment, and then she read it. Recalibration. "Would you like to characterize for us what those records contain?" Emily looked at the folder in front of her. Then she opened it. "I served in the Army from age 19 to age 27, she said. "The first 2 years were standard medical training and a conventional unit assignment. After that, I was selected for a specialized program. Forward surgical support attached to special operations units. I deployed 6 times, 5 overseas, 1 domestic training exercise." She paused. "My role in those deployments was trauma medical support under active combat conditions. I have documented K9 handler cross-training from my 4th deployment, where our unit operated with a working dog team and the primary handler was injured. I assumed handling responsibilities for approximately 11 days until a replacement handler was flown in." The room was quiet. "And after you separated from service?" Solis asked. "Civilian trauma nursing, 3 years in an ER, then the transfer here." "Why the transfer here?" She looked at the independent assessor. The question was asked in a tone that suggested it wasn't casual. "I requested the transfer," she said. "This facility had a position, and I applied for it." "You requested a transfer to a military facility specifically?" "Yes." Solis looked at her steadily. "Your record shows a commendation from your 5th deployment for medical action under fire. It also shows a notation I'd like you to explain. A performance flag from your 6th deployment, marked resolved, with no detail provided." Emily had known this was in there. She'd seen it when she read through the file 4 days ago. She'd sat with it and decided to let it come up naturally rather than address it preemptively, because preemptive defense was a kind of admission, and she hadn't done anything that required defending. "During my 6th deployment," she said, "I disagreed with a superior officer's decision regarding treatment prioritization for a working dog that had sustained injuries in the field. I administered treatment over his direct instruction to stand down and transfer the animal to a secondary post. The dog survived. The performance flag was filed by that officer and subsequently reviewed and closed when the full circumstances were documented." She looked at the panel. "I treated a working dog against a superior's order because I assessed that the animal would not survive transfer and immediate intervention was medically necessary," she said. "That flag was reviewed and dismissed. It's in the record." Oakes looked at her. "You've done this before," he said. "Decided on your own that a working dog was worth fighting for. It wasn't quite a question. I've consistently made medical decisions based on my assessment of the patient in front of me," she said. "That's what the training is for." Witt made a note. "We appreciate the clarity. We'll take a short recess." She stood in the corridor during the recess with a paper cup of water she wasn't drinking. Reed came out 2 minutes after her. He stood beside her, not looking at her. "They've pulled Hale's communication records," he said quietly, "from the 60 days preceding the evaluation. There are messages to the program office recommending against what he calls non-standard personnel assignments, sent before the evaluation team was even announced. She processed that. He knew the team was coming. He had advance notice, routine notification to facility command. Reed's voice had the controlled temperature of someone containing something. He started working on the provisional assignment angle before he had anything to work against. I was anticipating it. Because he knew the review was coming regardless. Because Aldridge's supplemental report wasn't the first thing filed. There was a complaint from the originating unit, Viper's original unit, filed 8 months ago. Questioned why the transfer happened without the required documentation. It went to Hale's desk and it was closed without action. Emily looked at the wall across the corridor. He buried it. He marked it resolved and filed it. No record of action taken. Reed finally looked at her. The panel has that document. They have the intake form with his signature. They have the communication records. They have Briggs. What does Briggs say? A pause. He says he was in the parking structure looking at something related to the review materials. He heard someone behind him. That's the last thing he remembers before the injury. Reed's voice was careful. That's all I can tell you right now. She nodded. She drank some of the water. Your records helped, Reed said. The handler cross-training, the combat deployment documentation. The panel isn't going to be able to dismiss the provisional assignment on qualification grounds. That's not why I filed the release, she said. He looked at her. I filed it because you needed the full picture, she said. Not because I needed them to know. He was quiet for a moment. Then the door to conference room 2 opened, and the panel assistant signaled them back in, and they went. The session that followed lasted 2 hours and covered ground she hadn't fully anticipated. The panel had done their work. They'd built a timeline that was more complete than what she had, assembling fragments from Aldridge's testimony, from the originating unit's complaint, from Hale's communication records, from the intake documentation. When they laid it out in sequence, it had a clarity that individual pieces hadn't. The original complaint from Viper's unit had named specific failures in the transfer documentation. Hale had received it, classified it as an administrative matter, and marked it resolved without requesting corrective action. Viper arrived at Raven Hollow without the required behavioral flag documentation and without triggering an intake specialist review. The processing order came 6 months later, after 4 handlers had attempted standard rehabilitation protocols on an animal whose trauma response had never been properly identified or treated. At every decision point, someone had signed off on the easier path. And at enough of those points that someone had been Hale. Then the panel asked Emily something she hadn't been expecting. We've reviewed the procurement records for the MWD unit, Witt said. Over the past 18 months, there have been 4 contracts issued for specialized K9 training equipment and pharmaceutical supplies. All 4 went to a single vendor, Cortex Animal Services. Are you familiar with that company? Emily shook her head. No. The contracts were approved through this facility's administrative office, 1 layer of approval, the facility commander. Witt looked at her over the top of her documentation. We're still reviewing the full scope of that vendor relationship, but I want to ask you, in your time in Block C, did you observe any instances of equipment or supplies that seemed inconsistent with standard program materials? She thought about this honestly. The pharmaceutical inventory in Block C was inconsistently stocked, she said slowly. I noticed it because I was managing feeding protocols for Viper, and the medication crossover documentation was incomplete. I assumed it was administrative backlog. Witt made a note. Emily sat with what she was hearing. The processing order, the buried complaint, the intake failure, and now procurement contracts to a single vendor running through a single approval point. Hale hadn't just been negligent, he'd been running something. The working dog program had been a funding mechanism, and the dogs in it were a budget line. And when a dog became inconvenient, when a dog had a behavioral history that might prompt an external review that might look at the program more carefully, the processing order was the cleanest solution. Remove the inconvenient element, close the file, keep the contract money moving. Viper hadn't been processed out because he was broken. He'd been processed out because he was a liability to something that had nothing to do with whether he could do his job. She kept her face even. She answered the panel's remaining questions with the same contained precision she'd been using all morning. When they dismissed her at 10:40, she walked back to Block C and sat on the folding stool and put her elbows on her knees and stayed like that for a while. Viper came to the kennel door and pressed his nose against it. She opened the latch. He came out and sat beside her without being asked. Just sat, his shoulder against her leg, warm and solid and present. "Yeah," she said. "I know." Hale was placed on administrative leave at 1400 that afternoon. She found out from Gallo, who had apparently developed a network of information sources that Emily had not previously appreciated. The leave was pending the outcome of the review, which was standard language for a situation that had already decided its direction and was waiting for the paperwork to catch up. She was in the middle of an evening round in Ward 4 when Pruitt found her. Pruitt looked like someone who had been processing information in transit and hadn't entirely finished. "He's gone," Pruitt said. "I know. The procurement thing—" She stopped, started again. "People in this building have been working under a man who was using the program as a money channel. Some of them knew something was wrong. Some of them didn't." She paused. "Most of them just kept their heads down." Emily looked at her. "That's usually how it works. I kept my head down for 4 years. And then you told me Reed's name," Emily said, "and what he was like." Pruitt was quiet. "That's not the same as—" "It moved things forward," Emily said. "That's what it did." It wasn't absolution. She wasn't offering absolution, partly because it wasn't hers to offer, and partly because Pruitt didn't need that from her. Pruitt needed to sit with her own accounting of the 4 years, and that was hers to do. But the thing Emily had said was also true, and the truth of it seemed to do something. Pruitt nodded once. She left. The message came at 22:17 that night. Not a text this time, an email to her personal account from a sender she didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The body contained 2 things, a document attachment and 4 words. "He knows about you." She opened the attachment. It was a personnel file. Not hers. The formatting was different, the header wrong, the classification markers she recognized from her own records but stamped differently. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. It was a file on her. Compiled, assembled, gathered from multiple sources. Her service record, her civilian employment history, her transfer request, her release petition. Someone had put this together, recently, based on the document timestamps. At the bottom, in a section that had no equivalent in her actual service file, were 3 paragraphs she had never seen before. She read them carefully. Twice. The paragraphs described an allegation, misconduct, her 6th deployment, the performance flag, but not the version in her actual record, not the one that had been reviewed and dismissed. This version was different. This version had details that hadn't happened, sourced to a statement she'd never given, attributed to a review that she was almost certain had never occurred. It was fabricated. She knew it was fabricated because she had been there and this was not what had happened. But it was professional and complete, and if someone showed it to the wrong person at the wrong moment in a review that was already contentious, it was the kind of thing that could shift a room before anyone had time to verify it. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the screen and understood what was happening. Hale was on administrative leave. His procurement irregularities were in front of a panel. His communication records were being reviewed. He was out of visible options in every direction, except one. And he'd been preparing it before any of this came out. Her records, her history, the performance flag. He'd had access to her release request, which had moved through the administrative office before reaching the certification board. He'd had time and motive to build something with it. The text. "You should have let the dog go." That had been a warning, an offer. Stop pressing, and this doesn't get used. She hadn't stopped pressing. She looked at the fabricated document on her screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she called Reed. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he was awake, which meant he'd been waiting. "Someone sent me something," she said. "I know," he said. "I got a copy 40 minutes ago. Someone in Hale's network sent it to 2 members of the review panel." The floor of the situation dropped another level. "He's trying to discredit me before the panel concludes," she said. Not a question. "Yes. And the panel has it now." "Yes." She sat with that for. "Can it be refuted?" "Your actual service record contradicts it at every material point. The performance flag documentation is clear. The problem is that introducing it creates delay, gives Hale's attorney time to build a narrative that puts the credibility of your testimony in question before the panel reaches its conclusion on the procurement review." Buys him time. That's what it's designed to do. She looked across her dark room. She thought about the document on the screen. She thought about what it would mean to have that thing circulating among people who didn't know her, who had no prior framework for who she was or what she'd actually done, who would have to sit with a fabricated misconduct allegation and a real service record and decide which version to weight while a man's attorney worked the delay. "What do I do?" she said. Reed was quiet for a moment. "Tomorrow morning, 0700, I need you to come in with your original field documentation from the 6th deployment, not just the service record, the actual field logs, the medical reports, the communications, anything you retained from that period. That's a lot to... Can you get it?" She thought about the storage unit she'd been paying $40 a month for in a facility outside the city, the boxes she hadn't opened in 2 years, the things she'd been keeping without being entirely sure why she was keeping them. "Yes," she said. 0700, he said. "And Carter." "Yeah." "This is going to get worse before it resolves. He's already in contact with his attorney, and the attorney is good. They're going to come at your credibility directly in the morning session." She looked at the fabricated document one more time. She looked at the 4 words in the email body. "He knows about you. He knew about her service record. He knew about the performance flag. He'd built a version of her history designed to make her look like someone whose testimony couldn't be trusted, and whose provisional handler assignment was an improper decision made based on false qualifications. He had built it carefully. He had been preparing it for a while. But he had built it out of her actual history. The deployments, the decisions, the things she'd done in the field, in conditions that nobody at Raven Hollow knew anything about. And he had gotten the details wrong, because he didn't have the field logs. He didn't have the actual documentation. He only had what had made it into the formal record. And she had everything else. "I'll have it," she said. 0700. She ended the call. She sat in the dark for another minute. Then she got up, found her keys, and drove 40 minutes to the storage facility outside the city because the boxes weren't going to bring themselves. And she had work to do. And she had learned a long time ago that the only way through a thing that was coming for you was to make sure you were moving toward it faster than it was moving toward you. The storage unit was a 10 by 12 room that smelled like cardboard and old cold, the kind of cold that accumulated in closed spaces over years, regardless of the outside season. Emily pulled the rolling door up at 11:47 p.m. and stood for a moment with her flashlight before she found the light switch on the interior wall. 3 boxes. She'd moved them 4 times in 8 years, 2 apartments, 1 temporary housing situation during a reassignment that had gotten complicated, and finally here. She'd never opened them at any of the moves, just loaded them and unloaded them and put them in the back of whatever storage space was available and left them there. She found the right box on the second try. It was labeled with a year and a letter. Her own system, compact and unlabeled enough to be meaningless to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. She cut the tape with her keys and folded back the lid. The field logs were in a rubber-banded stack, their covers warped from a humidity event sometime years ago, but the pages intact, the handwriting inside still legible. She pulled them out. Beneath them were the medical reports, her own documentation of cases she'd managed in the field, written in the shorthand she'd developed over 6 deployments, dense with abbreviations that would look like noise to anyone outside her training. And beneath those, in a waterproof sleeve she'd put them in before she even separated from service, because she'd understood even then that paper was fragile and some things needed to survive. The communications. The actual radio logs, the mission reports, the after-action assessments that had her name and her decisions and the timestamps and outcomes. The 6 deployment records were toward the bottom. She pulled them and sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit at midnight in a facility outside Greer Falls and read through them for the first time in 6 years. The situation had been exactly what she remembered, which was a relief in the specific way that it was always a relief when memory and record agreed. The working dog, a German shepherd named Kai, not a Malinois, different breed, different theater, had sustained a shrapnel injury during a perimeter breach. The primary handler was down with his own wound. The superior officer, a man named Colonel Beaumont, who Emily had disagreed with professionally on 3 separate prior occasions, had given a direct order to secure the dog in a holding position and leave it for the medevac that was 20 minutes out. Emily had assessed the injury. Shrapnel had compromised the femoral artery. The dog was not going to survive 20 minutes. She'd told Beaumont this. He'd repeated the order. She'd administered emergency field treatment anyway, tourniquet application, wound packing, the same interventions she would have applied to a human patient with the same injury, and the dog had survived long enough for the medevac and had been treated and had gone back to duty 6 months later. The performance flag was real. Her refusal of a direct order was real. What was not real, what Hale's fabricated document had invented, was the allegation that she'd done it carelessly, that she'd compromised the mission, that her intervention had delayed treatment for human casualties. The actual after-action report, written by 2 other officers present, documented the timeline clearly. Emily had managed the dog in the 4 minutes while the human triage was completed by other personnel. There was no delay. There was no compromise. There was a record that directly contradicted every material claim in the fabricated version. She stacked the documents carefully. She put them in a clean folder she'd brought from her apartment. She drove back to Greer Falls and got 2 hours of sleep and was in the building at 0645. Reed was already in conference room 2 when she arrived. He had coffee, real coffee, not the building's version, a thermos he'd clearly brought from elsewhere, and he poured her a cup without asking and pushed it across the table and looked at the folder she was carrying. 6 deployment records, she said, full documentation, medical reports, radio logs, after-action assessments. Timeline is complete and consistent. He took the folder and went through it. He was a fast reader. She'd noticed that before. He spent 12 minutes with it and then set it down. This dismantles the fabricated document at every point, he said. Yes. His attorney is going to try to argue that these are self-generated records that could have been altered. The radio logs have timestamps routed through the base communication system. They're on record at the originating installation. She'd checked this the night before, driving back from the storage unit, confirming what she already believed but needed to be certain of. The base communications archive is independent of anything I could access or modify. The logs there will match what I've brought. Reed looked at her. You've already thought through his counter-argument. I've had experience with people who try to use incomplete information to define you, she said. You learn to make sure the complete version is available. He picked up his coffee. The panel resumes at 0800. His attorney filed a motion last night to introduce the fabricated document as supplemental evidence. The panel chair is reviewing it this morning. My read is they'll allow it as submitted material, but they'll also request verification through independent channels. The base archive. Yes, that'll take time, probably 2 days to pull the originating records formally, which is what the attorney wants. He set down the cup. But we have something else. She waited. Briggs woke up fully yesterday evening. He remembered more than the initial statement. Reed's voice stayed level, but the thing underneath it was different now. He was in the parking structure reviewing a physical document, a printed copy of the Cortex vendor contracts, which Aldridge had given him for cross-reference against the program procurement logs. Someone came up behind him and used a blunt instrument. He heard the person say something before it happened. What did he hear? He's not certain. He was facing away, but he heard the word files and a male voice. Reed looked at her. The parking structure has cameras. Footage pulled from the relevant time window shows a male figure, military uniform, approaching from the stairwell. The image quality is partial. It's being enhanced. Emily sat with that for a moment. If that footage is usable, it won't be ready this morning, probably not today. He looked at the clock on the wall. What we have this morning is your documentation and the panel's own investigation materials. That has to be enough to get through today's session without the fabricated document doing what it's designed to do. And if it's not enough? He looked at her steadily. Then we wait for the footage and the archive records and we do it in 2 days instead. The panel hasn't reached its conclusion yet. The delay is a tactic, not a verdict. She understood that intellectually. She also understood that 2 more days of a fabricated misconduct allegation sitting in a review panel's pending file was 2 more days of it existing in the official record as an unresolved question, and that unresolved questions had a way of accumulating weight regardless of their eventual resolution. Okay, she said. Let's go in. But the attorney's name was Devereaux, and he was good in the specific way that made Emily's jaw tighten slightly. Not because he was dishonest, but because he was skilled at using honest technique on dishonest material, and that combination was genuinely difficult to navigate. He was 60, silver-haired, with the contained energy of someone who had been doing this long enough to have stopped being theatrical about it, and had found that restraint was more effective anyway. He introduced the fabricated document as a supplemental personnel matter, with the practiced neutrality of someone describing a weather pattern. He referenced the performance flag from the 6th deployment, the real one, and noted that the panel might wish to consider whether the pattern of behavior it suggested was relevant to the question of Emily Carter's professional judgment and the reliability of her testimony. He did not accuse her directly. He didn't need to. Implication did the work. Panel Chair Colonel Witt looked at the document. She looked at Emily. Nurse Carter, this supplemental material has been submitted for the panel's consideration. Do you have a response? Yes, ma'am. Emily opened her folder. The document submitted by counsel contains several specific factual claims about my conduct during my 6th deployment. I have the primary source documentation for the events in question. I'd like to walk the panel through the discrepancies. Devereux said, the provenance of self-retained personal records. The radio logs, Emily said, are time-stamped through the base communication system at the originating installation. They are independently archived and can be verified through that system without reference to anything I've personally retained. She looked at Witt. I would request that the panel submit a formal verification request to that installation for the relevant records. The process takes approximately 2 days. Witt looked at Oakes. Something passed between them. We'll submit the verification request, Witt said. In the meantime, the supplemental document will be held as pending unverified material. Devereux's expression moved in a way that wasn't quite dissatisfaction, but was adjacent to it. He had wanted the 2 days of delay without the countermeasure running simultaneously. He'd gotten the delay and the countermeasure both. The morning session continued for another hour, focused on the procurement records and the Cortex vendor contracts. Devereux tried twice to redirect the conversation toward procedural questions about the evaluation and the provisional assignment. Both times Witt moved past it, with the efficiency of someone who had read the documents more carefully than the attorney had anticipated. At 10:30, they broke for recess. Emily went to the corridor. She stood at the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the facility grounds, the access road, the tree line past the perimeter fence, the Block C yard where she'd walked Viper in the cold, dark mornings when nobody was watching and the work was just the work, uncomplicated by any of this. Reed came to stand beside her. You did well in there, he said. She didn't respond to that. The camera footage. Is there any possibility it moves faster than 2 days? I pushed this morning. Forensic imaging has it. Best case is tomorrow afternoon. She nodded. She kept looking at the grounds. The panel has what it needs on the procurement side, Reed said. The Cortex contracts, the approval chain, the buried complaint from the originating unit. Hale's attorney can't undo that documentation. What he's trying to do is muddy the water on your credibility specifically. If your testimony is questioned, it creates room to argue that the behavioral assessment, the evaluation results, even the review request were influenced by someone with a compromised record. It's a reasonable legal strategy, she said. It's a strategy that depends on the fabricated document surviving verification, Reed said, which it won't. She looked at him. You're certain? I'm certain the archive records will contradict it. I'm certain the panel is already skeptical. Solis has been asking verification questions about every submitted document since day one. That's her job and she's doing it. He paused. What I'm not certain of is the timing, and timing matters in a review like this. She knew that. She'd known it at midnight in a storage unit on a concrete floor. One more thing, Reed said. His voice shifted slightly. Less operational, more careful. The panel is going to ask you about the transfer request. Your specific reasons for transferring to this facility. She looked at him. That came up yesterday. It's going to come up again. Devereux is going to frame it as deliberate targeting, that you came here with the intent to involve yourself in the MWD program and manufacture a situation that would expose Hale. He doesn't have evidence for that, but he doesn't need evidence to ask the question. She turned back to the window. Why had she transferred here? She'd asked for the transfer herself. Military facility, mid-sized, Mountain West. She'd known about the MWD program. She'd known about the funding irregularities. Not the details. Not Hale specifically, but she'd heard things in the overlap between her old network and her new civilian life. The kind of things that circulated through people who'd served and stayed connected. that a particular program in a particular facility was being run badly, and that the animals in it were paying the price. She hadn't come to expose anyone. She'd come because she couldn't stop knowing what she knew and doing nothing with it. There was a difference between those two things. She believed the difference was real. She also understood that the difference would be difficult to explain to someone who was motivated to collapse it. "I'll answer honestly," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know it was coming." Washout. The afternoon session was the hardest part. Devereaux asked the question in the fourth hour, after the panel had worked through the procurement timeline and the intake failure documentation and the communication records. He asked it the way he asked everything, quietly, without visible angle, as though the answer would naturally arrive and he was simply creating space for it. "Nurse Carter, can you tell the panel what specifically prompted your transfer request to this facility?" She looked at him. She looked at the panel. "I was aware that the military working dog program at this facility had been experiencing difficulties," she said. "I had heard, through informal professional channels, that animals in the program were not receiving adequate support. I wanted to work somewhere that had a program like this, and I had reason to believe this one needed help." She paused. "That's not the same as coming here to investigate anyone. I came here because I thought I could be useful." "You came here because you had heard things," Devereaux said, "about this facility, about this program, before you applied." "Yes." "And you didn't disclose that prior knowledge in your transfer application." "The transfer application asked about my professional qualifications and my reasons for seeking a military facility assignment. My answer addressed both. I said I had a background in emergency medicine and an interest in working in a facility with a military working dog unit." She kept her voice even. "That's accurate." "It's incomplete," Devereaux said. "Most answers are," she said. "The question determines the scope of the answer." Something in the room shifted. Solace made a note. Witt's expression was neutral in the particular way that indicated active processing. Devereaux moved on. He was good enough to know when a line wasn't going to develop the way he wanted, and he moved on to the provisional assignment angle, working through the certification gap, the handler exception, the regulatory framework. Emily answered each point with the documentation she had and the regulation citation she'd memorized over the past 3 weeks. It went on for an hour. At the end of it, Witt called a close for the day and told both parties to expect the panel's preliminary findings within 48 hours, pending verification of the submitted supplemental materials. Emily drove home. She fed herself something that she didn't pay much attention to and sat in her apartment in the dark for a while before she slept. The camera footage came back in 31 hours. Reed called her at 0614 the following morning. His voice was different, not the measured operational tone of the past week, but something underneath that had resolved. "Footage is enhanced," he said. "Clear image, confirmed identification." A pause. "It's not Hale." She sat up. "Who?" "Deputy Administrator for Facilities, name of Warren Price. He's been in the building for 11 years. Handles budget allocation, procurement processing." Reed's voice was careful. "He's the secondary approval layer on the Cortex contracts. Hale was the primary. Price was running the contracts through and taking a processing fee on the back end. We found it in his personal accounts this morning. He was protecting Hale because Hale was protecting him. The investigation opened on his financials 4 hours ago. He's been taken in for questioning by the criminal division." A beat. "The fabricated document on you, Tim. Price had access to the administrative processing system. He would have been able to pull your release request before it reached the certification board. He built the document." She sat with that. "Hale didn't make it." "Hale may not have known about it. The criminal division is sorting that now." Reed paused. "What I can tell you is that your documentation, combined with the archive records from the originating installation, which came back at 0200 this morning, has fully contradicted the fabricated version. The panel has both sets. The supplemental document is going to be withdrawn." She looked at her window. Early light, gray and real. "Panel findings today," Reed said. 1100. You should be there." She got to the building at 0830 and went straight to Block C. Viper was awake. He came to the kennel door immediately when she pushed through, his whole body oriented to her arrival, and she unlatched the door and he came out and she sat on the floor. Not the stool, the actual floor. and he put his head in her lap and she sat there with her hand on him for a while, without doing anything or saying anything or thinking about what was going to happen in 2.5 hours. She thought about Kai instead, the German shepherd from the 6th deployment, the one she'd treated on the ground in the dark, while Beaumont stood behind her giving an order she didn't follow. She'd heard later, through the network, that Kai had gone back to duty and worked another 3 years before retiring to his handler's family home. She'd never confirmed it. She'd just heard it and held it. Some things you did without knowing the outcome. You made the call with the information you had and the training you had and the understanding that some patients couldn't wait for the right moment, and you didn't get to know, always, how it ended. Sometimes you found out later. She looked down at Viper. He was watching her with the focused, patient attention of a dog who had learned that watching her was worth doing. She had found out how this one ended. "Come on," she said. She got up and clipped his lead. "Let's go outside." They walked the yard perimeter one time, slow, the way she'd walked it with him for the first time 3 weeks ago, when his stride had opened up like he was remembering. Today his stride was just his stride, easy and long and sure, like a dog who had stopped remembering and started just moving. She brought him back inside at 10:45 and settled him in the kennel and went to conference room 2. The room was different at 1100 than it had been at 0800 the morning before. Hale was present, which she hadn't expected, seated at the end of the table with Devereaux beside him, in uniform, with the expression of someone who had been processing the direction of things and had arrived at a particular stillness. Price was not present, which was conspicuous in its own way. Reed was at the side of the room. Aldridge was present in the corner, same position as before, same quality of visible relief in his posture that he was trying to make invisible. Pruitt was in the back row of observer chairs, which Emily hadn't expected either, and Gallo was beside her, which she also hadn't expected, but somehow wasn't surprised by. Witt called the room to order. She didn't waste time. "This panel has completed its preliminary review of the matters brought before it over the past week," she said. "I'll summarize the findings for the record and for those present." She went through it in order. First, the intake documentation failure. Viper's transfer had been processed with an incomplete review. The required behavioral specialist consult had not been conducted. The responsibility for that failure fell to the facility commander, who had signed the intake confirmation. This constituted a violation of program protocol and a failure of administrative duty. Second, the processing order. Issued without adequate behavioral assessment, without consultation with a qualified specialist, and after a complaint from the originating unit had been closed without action. The processing order was formally rescinded. Viper's inactive classification was removed. His service record was amended to reflect the absence of documented behavioral failure and the presence of an untreated trauma response stemming from a field incident 14 months prior. Third, the Cortex procurement contracts. 11 contracts over 18 months, all routed through single-layer approval, with financial irregularities identified in associated accounts. The matter had been referred to the Criminal Division for full investigation. The scope of that investigation now included Warren Price, whose involvement was a matter of active criminal inquiry and extended to the question of Colonel Hale's knowledge and role in the contracting process. Hale's expression didn't change during this portion. She watched him. He was very still in the way of someone who had stopped fighting in a particular direction and was calculating others. Fourth, the fabricated personnel document. The supplemental material submitted by Defense Counsel had been compared against independently verified base communications archive records and found to be materially inaccurate at multiple specific points. The document was withdrawn from the record. The panel noted for the record that the fabrication of personnel documentation in the context of an active military review was a serious matter that had been referred to the appropriate authority. Devereaux said something quiet to Hale. Hale said nothing back. Fifth, the provisional handler assignment and certification question. Emily's service record, including classified materials released through appropriate channels, documented field handler cross-training and combat deployment experience with military working dog teams. This was found to constitute qualifying experience under the alternate pathway provision of the certification framework. Her provisional assignment was formally validated. Her certification application was approved for expedited direct assessment. Witt looked up from the document in front of her. "Colonel Hale," she said, "you are relieved of command of this facility effective immediately, pending the outcome of the Criminal Division investigation into the procurement irregularities. You will be escorted from the building following this session and will have no further contact with facility staff or program materials until the investigation concludes. Hale looked at her. He looked at the table. He looked at some point beyond it that nobody else in the room could see. "Understood," he said. His voice was entirely flat. That was all he said. She'd expected something else. A counter, a redirection, one more attempt at the frame he'd been operating inside. But there was nothing. Just the flat word and the stillness, and then Devereaux putting papers together beside him. The room held its breath for a moment. Then Witt said, "This panel is adjourned," and the breath released, and the room started to move. She didn't watch Hale leave. She had no interest in the specific theater of watching him walk out. No need for that particular image. What she did was stand up and look at Reed, who was still at the side of the room, and he gave her a single nod that was enough. Aldridge passed her on his way out and stopped briefly. He looked like he'd slept for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it." She shook her head. "You bought the time. I just used it." He almost smiled. Then he moved on. Gallo was waiting in the corridor with the expression of someone who had been trying to contain a significant emotional response and had been only partially successful. "The yellow tag," she said. "I want to be there when it comes off." Emily looked at her. "When did you become invested in this dog?" "About 3 days into watching you get up at 5 in the morning to sit on a folding stool near his cage," Gallo said. "Honestly, it was the stool. Nobody brings a folding stool to something they don't care about." Emily thought that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in weeks. The yellow tag came off that afternoon. She brought Gallo and she brought Aldridge, and she did not make an announcement or invite an audience because it wasn't a performance. She unclipped it from the kennel door with one hand. Handler caution. Unpredictable. Do not approach without supervision. And dropped it in the waste bin by the wall. Then she took the card that had been on the kennel for 4 days, printed and laminated by the records office after the panel's preliminary findings had cleared, and zip-tied it to the door. It had his name at the top, his real file, his service number, his deployment record, his commendations from the 3rd Special Operations Support Battalion, the dates and locations and evaluations from 47 field deployments. It had his status, active. And at the bottom, under handler assignment, it had her name. Viper stood at the front of the kennel and sniffed the new card through the chain link. His nose worked across the surface for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "It's yours." Gallo made a sound that was disguised as a cough. Aldridge looked at the ceiling briefly. Emily unlatched the kennel. The formal certification assessment happened 3 weeks later. A direct assessment before the program board, 3 evaluators, 3 hours. She and Viper ran through the full handler evaluation, scent work, tactical commands, obstacle sequences, stress protocols. He was clean through all of it. Not perfect. He broke a prolonged stay in the 2nd hour when a vehicle backfired on the access road outside the assessment building, and she had to reset him, and the evaluators noted the deviation. She was glad it wasn't perfect. Perfect would have been a lie about what they were, what they'd been through, what recovery actually looked like. The break and the reset and the continuation, that was the real story. She passed. He passed. The certification arrived in writing 2 days after that, a document she read once and put in the folder with the field logs from the 6th deployment and the after-action assessments she'd carried through 8 years of moves. The folder went back in the box, and the box went back in storage, and she drove home and fed Viper. She'd been granted temporary handler housing accommodation, which meant a facility apartment with a ground floor entrance and a small yard, and sat on the back step in the evening air while he investigated the perimeter of the yard with the focused attention of a dog who was doing his job. She watched him work the perimeter. Back and forth, nose down, the systematic grid pattern of a trained detection dog running a search even when there was nothing to search for, because the training was in the muscle and the muscle didn't stop. Briggs was out of the hospital. He'd sent her a message, brief, direct, the way his assessment supervision had been, saying he'd be back on the evaluation team in 6 weeks. She'd sent back 2 words, good news. It had seemed like enough. Price was facing 3 criminal charges, 2 related to procurement fraud, and 1 related to the assault on Briggs. The investigation was ongoing, and the outcome was not yet determined, but the evidence was documented, and the documentation was thorough. And those things together had a way of reaching conclusions that were hard to avoid. Hale's matter was more complicated. The criminal division had found no direct evidence that he'd known about Price's financial arrangements. What they had found was a pattern of deliberate inaction, closed complaints, unsigned corrections, processing orders issued without the underlying work. A man who had used the bureaucratic system not to steal, but to maintain conditions that allowed stealing to happen around him, unchecked, while he signed the forms and looked at the horizon. The Army had a word for that kind of negligence when it reached sufficient scale. Several words, actually, spread across several provisions of the UCMJ. The proceedings were formal and slow, and Emily had stopped tracking them closely because the outcome, while not yet final, had a shape that was visible, and that shape was not favorable to Hale, and her energy was better spent elsewhere. She had found, in the weeks since the panel, that she had a significant amount of energy for the work. The floor rotation, the MWD sessions, the handler training requirements that came with certification. She was tired in the right way, the way that came from doing a full thing rather than a partial one. Pruitt came to find her in Block C on a Thursday afternoon, which had become, without either of them discussing it, something that happened periodically. She stood inside the door with her arms not crossed, which Emily had noted as a permanent shift that had occurred sometime during the week of the panel and hadn't reversed. "The program is getting 2 new dogs," Pruitt said. "Transfers. Young ones. First assignments." "When?" "4 weeks. They're looking at handler assignments." She paused. "Aldridge is going to recommend you for the primary coordination role, both new animals and Viper." Emily looked at her. Coordination role is an administrative function. It's also a training function and a mentorship function when there are new handlers. Pruitt's voice was dry, but not cold. A different kind of dry from before, one that had the texture of someone speaking plainly rather than performing certainty. "You'd still run floor rotations. You're not going to stop being a nurse because you're also a handler, Carter. You can be 2 things." Emily thought about that. Being 2 things. She'd been 2 things for a long time, had been the person with the classified record and the person in the civilian scrubs. The one who knew how to treat injuries in the dark, and the one who documented everything carefully in the light, and she'd kept those halves separate in the way she'd kept the boxes in storage, unlabeled, in the back. The panel had opened the boxes. The record was in the room now. Both versions of her were in the same document, and the document had her name on it, and the name on Viper's kennel card. "Okay," she said. Pruitt nodded. She left without further ceremony, which was how she did most things, and which Emily had come to understand was its own kind of respect. There was a moment, a few days later, that she hadn't planned for and didn't expect. She was running Viper through an early morning session in the Block C yard when Tibbs came by. The retired corporal who'd told her to go when the panel summons came. He was ambulatory now, 2 weeks post-discharge conditioning walk, moving carefully with a cane on the exterior path that ran past the yard fence. He stopped when he saw them. He watched for a moment. Viper was running a directional sequence, crisp and focused, turning on her hand signals with the precision of a dog who had figured out that precision was satisfying in itself. "That the dog everyone said was done," Tibbs said. "Yes," Emily said. He watched a while longer. His expression was the expression of a man who had seen a lot of things in service and had developed a preference for things that resolved correctly. "Good," he said. He moved on. She watched him go and then turned back to Viper, who had held his position through the entire exchange and was now looking at her with the patient expectancy of a dog waiting for the next command. She released him. He shook himself and came to her side, and they walked the rest of the session together in the early cold, her and this dog, who had been written off and processed and tagged and shelved, and who was now on a packed earth yard outside a military hospital in a mountain western city, doing the work he had been built for with a woman who had also, at various points, been written off and processed and filed under the wrong category by people who hadn't read to the bottom of the page. She thought about that walk home from the records office, the day she'd first read his file. The shape of the thing she'd recognized, not just in his history but in the pattern of it, the way that the systems built to support someone could become, through negligence or convenience or active malice, the thing that buried them instead. She'd seen it before. She'd seen it in the field, and she'd seen it in the civilian world, and she'd seen it in the bureaucratic machinery of institutions that had good intentions at the foundation and complicated realities in the execution. The good people who looked away because looking directly was expensive. The mediocre people who signed the forms without reading them because reading them required caring about the outcome. And occasionally, at the top, the people who had figured out that the machinery could be useful to them if they kept its attention elsewhere. None of that was new. None of it was surprising, which was its own kind of grim knowledge. What she'd learned, or not learned exactly, but confirmed, in the particular way that you confirmed things you'd always believed by seeing them proved in the specific, was that the machinery could also be redirected, that the same documents and regulations and review frameworks that had been used to bury things could be used to unbury them, if someone was willing to read far enough and hold the position long enough and do the unglamorous daily work of showing up on a folding stool at 0500 when nobody was watching and everything felt uncertain. She thought about the handlers who'd come before her, the 4 certified professionals who had worked with Viper using the right protocols for the wrong problem, who had followed the procedures and gotten the expected results and filed the expected paperwork and never gone back to the file to see what they were missing. They weren't bad handlers. They just hadn't read to the bottom of the page. She thought about what it cost to read to the bottom of the page. The time, the uncertainty, the willingness to look at something everyone else had assessed and say, wait, I think there's more here, knowing that most people would interpret that willingness as arrogance or insubordination or sentimentality depending on their particular investment in the existing conclusion. She had paid those costs. She would pay them again. Viper pressed briefly against her leg as they walked, the casual weight of a dog who was not anxious, just present, doing the thing he did when he wanted to confirm that she was there without making an event of it. She was there. She'd always been there in one form or another. The version of herself that read the file all the way down, that sat on the floor at midnight in a storage unit, that kept the boxes even when she didn't know why she was keeping them. The version that had learned to be quiet about the work, because the work was the point, not the being known for it. She didn't need people to know. She never had. But there was something different now about the file with her name and her record and both halves of her history in the same document. Something that felt less like exposure and more like accuracy, like the complete version of a thing finally matching what the thing actually was. She was a nurse. She was a handler. She was a woman who had treated injuries in the field under conditions most people wouldn't believe, and who had also sat on a folding stool for 11 minutes watching a dog's ears move and written it down carefully in a notebook because it mattered. She was someone who had kept boxes in storage and known, some part of her, that she'd eventually need what was in them. She was the person who read to the bottom of the page. That was enough. It had always been enough. The problem had never been whether it was enough. The problem had been the number of rooms where the complete version of her wasn't allowed in the door, and the patients required to wait for the right room or to build one. Viper broke from the heel to investigate something at the edge of the yard. A smell in the corner, something in the root structure of the scrubby grass that required significant nose attention. She let him go. He worked it for 30 seconds, decided it was interesting but not significant, and came back to her side without being called. She looked at him. 67 pounds of recovered capacity, moving through a Tuesday morning like a dog who didn't know how close he'd come to a different ending and didn't need to know because the ending was this. The yard, the work, the woman beside him who had decided he was worth reading all the way down to the bottom of. Some things, she thought, didn't need a bigger frame than that. Some things were enough in the exact size they were. She gave him the signal for the next command, and he was already moving before her hand finished the gesture, reading her the way he read the field, with full attention, with trained instinct, with the particular kind of trust that wasn't blind but was earned, built over 23 days of folding stools and midnight food containers, and one quiet voice in a crisis saying, "Stay with me," and meaning it. He had stayed. So had she. And in the end, that was the whole story. Not the panel, not the documents, not the public collapse of a man who had used his authority as a personal convenience. Those were outcomes. What came before the outcomes was the part that mattered, the choosing, in the dark and without audience, to show up for something that everyone else had already written off. The people who wait for permission to fight for the things that matter will wait a long time, and the things will not wait with them. The yard was cold and bright. Viper was working. Emily Carter was